An alpha can conquer the wild. He can command the respect of every wolf in the territory, make the earth tremble beneath his boots, and silence an entire great hall with a single look. He can draw boundary lines that nations respect. He can hold his pack together through famine and drought, and the long, bitter seasons when the mountain passes freeze over and there is nothing to do but endure. But no amount of power, not the strength in his hands, not the ancient laws carved into stone tablets older than the fortress itself, not the loyalty of 1,000 wolves sworn to his bloodline by blood and bone, can guarantee the one thing that truly matters: a legacy, a heart to carry his name when he finally joins the ancestors. And that is the quiet, aching truth that lives behind every iron wall a powerful man builds around himself, and not the kind of truth a man speaks aloud, the kind he carries in the dark hours of the night, when the fortress is silent and the mountains are the only witnesses, and the cold of the stone presses through everything he has built and reminds him that a throne held by one person is just a chair. This is the story of a king who forgot what warmth felt like, not because the warmth left him, because it was taken, and he had spent 3 years making sure nothing could take anything from him again. And this is the story of a woman who had almost forgotten she deserved any warmth at all. Not because she was weak, she was anything but because the world she had grown up in had done a very thorough, very persistent job of placing her just far enough from the center of things that she had quietly, carefully, learned to live at the edge, or they were not supposed to happen to each other. The ancient laws said arrangement, transaction, legacy, not love. The mate bond said otherwise. You are watching Marked by Midnight. Chapter 1. The announcement did not arrive with trumpets. It did not arrive with flowers or sweet words wrapped in silk, the kind of language men use when they want to dress something hard in something soft so you don't feel the edges until you're already holding it. It arrived the way Adrian did everything, sharp, direct, and completely stripped of sentiment. A single scroll, sealed with the crest of the Costa bloodline, distributed across 7 surrounding territories by his most trusted messenger wolves before the first frost of autumn had even begun. The wax seal was deep red, almost the color of dried blood under moonlight, and the words inside were fewer than most men use to introduce themselves. The Alpha King of the Costa territory requires a companion of breeding age. Purpose, continuation of the Costa bloodline, and legacy of the territory. Terms, governed by the ancient binding laws of the Seventh Covenant. No emotional entanglements required. Applicants must present themselves at the mountain fortress before the next full moon. That was all. No romance, no promise of affection, no soft language to dress up what it was. A transaction? Most women who read that scroll laughed out loud and passed it to the next person with the expression of someone who has been handed something absurd. A few were genuinely offended. Who did this Alpha King think he was to word a thing like that with such clinical efficiency, as though a companion were a supply delivery? Some quietly folded it away and told themselves they had too much dignity for it. Some burned it. Maya read it 3 times. She sat at the narrow wooden table in the small dwelling she had occupied at the edge of the Stevens territory, a place where the wind came through the wall gaps in winter, and the floorboards remembered every footstep, and the view from the single window was a stretch of flat grassland that went on until the sky decided to stop it. And she read those words until the ink blurred slightly at the edges of her vision. She was 27 years old. She had spent the better part of those years learning to take up less space, to ask for less, to want carefully, quietly, in ways that would not embarrass her when the answer was no. The Stevens bloodline had never been unkind to her exactly. No deliberate cruelty, no overt dismissal. But they had never truly seen her either. She was the one who handled the things nobody else wanted to handle. The ledger work, the difficult negotiations with difficult suppliers, the after-midnight walks along the boundary line when the patrol wolves didn't turn up. She was the one who sat at the far end of every gathering table, who was thanked in passing and then passed by, whose name was spoken as an afterthought, if it was spoken at all. She had no promised mate, no territory of her own, no great bloodline alliance to offer anyone who was looking for such things. But she had something. She had always had it, even when she couldn't name it. A deep, slow-burning want for a life that was genuinely hers, not borrowed, not squeezed into the margins of someone else's story, not the leftover life of a woman who had made herself useful enough to keep around without ever being chosen. Her own, fully, completely, with both hands. She looked at the scroll. She thought about the mountain fortress of the Costa territory, a place she had read about in the old territorial histories, ancient and formidable, and set against the Vorder peaks, like something the mountains themselves had decided should exist there. She thought about a king who described his search for a companion with the language of a treaty rather than a courtship, and she thought about what that told her about him, and she thought about what it would mean to go. She folded the scroll carefully. She did not tell anyone. She packed one trunk, only the essentials, because she had learned that essential things take up less space than people expect, and before the week was out, she began the journey north toward the mountains, toward whatever this was going to be. The Vorder Range announced itself before it was visible. A change in the air first, a quality of cold that was different from the lowland cold, sharper and cleaner, carrying the scent of pine resin and rock and distances that had not been touched. The roads that climbed toward the Costa territory narrowed gradually, trading the wide merchant paths of the flatlands for older tracks that wound between increasingly serious stands of ancient trees. Maya travelled by covered cart for most of it, then on foot for the last 3 miles of climbing, to her trunk carried by a young border wolf who had met the cart at the lower checkpoint and said very little the entire walk up. She was grateful for the silence. She used it to settle herself. The mountain fortress came into view around a long bend in the rock path, and it stopped her for a moment. She had read descriptions of it, histories, maps. None of them had quite conveyed the way it simply sat against the mountain, as though it had grown there. A structure built not for beauty, but for permanence, for the statement that this bloodline had stood for 400 years and would stand for 400 more. The stone was dark, almost black in the overcast autumn light, and the towers did not reach upward decoratively so much as they seemed to push up from the earth, like old bones refusing to stay buried. And ancient symbols were carved above every arch. She recognized the old covenant script, the binding law language of the first territorial wolves, marking the entrance the way a wolf marks a border. I was here. I am here. This is mine. She breathed in. She breathed out. She was not afraid. She noticed that about herself with a kind of quiet interest. She had thought she might be on the journey here. But standing at the outer gate of the mountain fortress, looking up at 4 centuries of power made into stone, what she felt was not fear. It was something closer to recognition. There were 3 other women at the gate when Maya arrived, all of them from territories with considerably more standing than the Stevens name carried. The first wore her family's crest openly on a brooch at her collar, and the heavy worked silver of an old bloodline, making itself visible immediately. The second had arrived with an attendant, a young woman who carried a second bag, and stood with the practiced posture of someone whose entire purpose was to convey that her employer required attended. The third was tall and beautiful, in a way that seemed designed specifically to impress. The kind of woman whose appearance was clearly the result of both good fortune and considerable effort, who had spent a lifetime being looked at first and spoken to second. Maya stood behind all of them, with her single trunk and her steady breathing, and said nothing. An elder emerged from the gate, a man in his 60s, her silver-streaked hair pulled back from a face that had been reading people for so long it had settled into the permanent expression of someone receiving information. He had the particular stillness of men who have stood in the same place through many things, and been changed by none of them into someone who startles easily. He introduced himself as Alfred, one of the Alpha King's 2 senior advisors, and he moved through the group of arrivals with a patience that had nowhere to hurry to. He glanced at the brooch. He nodded politely at the attendant. He looked at the tall woman long enough to see what was on the surface, then moved past it. And then he looked at Maya. He looked at her for a long time, not studying her appearance, looking at something else, the quality of how she stood, the way her eyes moved when they met his, or the particular kind of patience in her face that was not blankness, but presence. She met his gaze and did not look away. Something shifted in Alfred's expression, just slightly, just for a moment. It was the almost invisible rearrangement of a man whose expectation has been quietly exceeded. "Your name," he said. "Maya, from the Stevens bloodline." He wrote it down. He wrote all their names down with the same pen and the same unhurried precision. And then he led them through the gate and into the fortress, and Maya crossed the threshold of the mountain stronghold with the same quiet steadiness that had carried her up the last 3 miles of trail. The interior was exactly what the outside promised: grand without warmth, powerful without softness, stone floors that held the cold even in summer, dark and smooth from centuries of use, or tapestries on the walls depicting old hunts and older ceremonies, scenes from the early days of the Costa bloodline when the territory had been carved out by force and held by will, and the distinction between the two had sometimes been difficult to identify. Hallways wide enough for a patrol of 6 wolves to move through at speed. Every surface spoke of authority, of longevity, of a line that had bent in storms but never broken. The other women murmured to each other as they were led through, quiet observations, small assessments of the space. Maya was silent. She noticed the way the torchlight shifted on the carved ceiling. The patterns there were not decoration. They were the old territorial maps, the boundary lines of the Costa lands, rendered in stone with the same permanence that had been given to everything else here. Every river, every ridgeline, every pass and peak recorded above the heads of everyone who walked beneath it as a constant reminder of what this bloodline had built and what it held. She noticed the smell of the fortress, pine resin and deep earth, and something ancient underneath it all, the particular mineral smell of old stone that has held human lives within it for generations. And beneath that, so faint she almost missed it, the warm, specific scent that was simply the alpha of this place. Present everywhere, woven into the air of every room, the way a wolf's presence lives in a territory, even when the wolf is elsewhere. She was still thinking about that when Alfred's young household attendant, a compact, a bright-eyed young woman who introduced herself as Marvis with the energy of someone who had been waiting for new people to inform, settled them in a receiving room and explained the schedule. "The Alpha King will see each of you individually," Marvis said, standing very straight and clearly enjoying the importance of knowing what happened next. "This evening, before the moon rises." The woman with the brooch smoothed her collar. The one with the attendant whispered something. The tall woman stood in the center of the room as though she had already decided it was hers. Maya sat down on the bench nearest the window, folded her hands in her lap, and breathed. She thought about what she wanted to say when her turn came. Not what would impress, not what would soften him. What was true. She had always found that truth, they said plainly and without performance, was the most useful thing she had. She would start there. When her name was called last, Maya noticed the timing without letting it land anywhere it could sting. She had learned long ago that last did not mean least. It sometimes simply meant that whoever made the list had run out of imagination for the middle positions and put the complicated things at the end without realizing that was often where the best ones were. She followed Marvis down a long corridor that grew quieter with every step, past doors of heavy dark wood, past oil lamps in iron brackets that threw amber pools across the stone floor. The corridor ended at a pair of doors that Marvis pushed open with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times, and Maya stepped through into the room. It was all dark wood and firelight, walls lined with shelves that held territorial documents and old histories, and in one corner, a pair of boots that someone had set down and forgotten. The fire was well built, burning clean and even. The room smelled of worn leather and whiskey, and that same faint pine scent she had noticed in the air of the fortress generally, but here it was stronger, more present. Adrian was standing with his back to her when she entered. Maya had assembled some version of him in her mind on the journey here. The scrolls described an Alpha King, which meant power and authority, and the weight of a bloodline. But she had not quite expected the particular quality of the stillness in him. He was broad-shouldered, yes. He had the physical presence of a man whose body had been forged by a life that required it. But what struck her was not the size of him. It was the specific, controlled quality of how he stood, like a drawn bowstring that had been drawn so long it had forgotten any other position. He turned, grey eyes, sharp and direct, the kind that do not soften to make other people comfortable. Not cruel. She was clear enough about the difference between cold and cruel to see it. Just direct. The look of someone who had stopped spending energy on the diplomatic cushioning of his attention years ago. He looked at her with complete attention and no warmth, and she looked back the same way, and there was a moment of mutual, equal taking stock that felt, even then, even on the first night, like something unusual, something that would not be easily forgotten. "Maya," he said. Not a question, but a landing. The name placed like a stone. Yes, Stephen's bloodline. Yes. He waited. Most people, faced with his silence, filled it. She did not. Something in his jaw moved. He gestured to the chair across the table. "Sit." She sat. "You understand what this arrangement is," he said. "I do. No sentiment, no expectation of affection. The ancient binding laws of the Seventh Covenant govern both parties. Protection, provision, continuation of the Costa bloodline. You receive standing, safety, and a home within this fortress. Nothing beyond those terms is offered." Maya looked at him steadily. She had known from the first reading of the scroll what this was. She had made her peace with the terms before she packed the trunk. She was not here to be surprised by reality, but she was also not here to be less than what she was. "I understand the terms," she said. "I accept them. But I want you to understand something in return before we proceed." He waited. Not impatiently. She would learn over weeks that Adrian's silences were rarely impatient. They were simply the space he left for things to arrive. "I am not a piece on a board," she said. "I will honor every ancient law that governs this arrangement, and I will carry my role here with everything I have. I will not be a complication. I will not be a problem. She paused, held his gaze. But I will not disappear into these walls either. I will be present. Fully present. Every day I am here, I will be entirely here. That is what I am offering. The fire moved between them. The room was very quiet. Adrian looked at her the way he had looked at her since she entered the room. Directly, entirely, what without the social machinery, most people layer over genuine attention. And in that look, she caught something that she would spend weeks revisiting. Not warmth, not approval, a quality of recalibration, as though a figure he had already categorized had stepped sideways out of the category and left him holding an empty file. Agreed, he said. And that was how it began. What Maya did not know that night, what she would not discover until later, pieced together from conversations with Alfred and a few carefully worded disclosures from Marvis, was that the scroll had not been Adrian's only preparation. Before the first woman arrived at the fortress gate, Alfred and Edward had spent the better part of a fortnight moving through the surrounding territories. Not conspicuously, carefully, but the way experienced men gather intelligence through the ordinary conversations of ordinary visits, the kind of information gathering that happens in kitchens and market stalls, and the quiet corners of gathering halls rather than in formal meetings. They had learned who each woman was when nobody important was watching, and about Maya they had learned specific things. That she had spent 3 consecutive winters as the primary caretaker of an elderly woman in the Stevens territory who had outlived all her kin and had no one else, bringing meals, managing the woman's small property, making sure the firewood held through the cold months, asking nothing in return and telling no one about it. That she had been passed over for a territory position she was better qualified for than the man who received it, and had continued doing the work of the position without the title, without complaint, without the kind of quiet resentment that curdles into something visible over time. That she had a reputation among the people who actually knew her rather than the people who simply shared a territory with her, for the particular quality of honesty that does not soften itself to be more comfortable and does not sharpen itself to be more impressive. It was simply honest. Alfred had placed her name at the bottom of the list deliberately. Not because she was least important, because Adrian paid the most careful attention to the last thing left in a room. He always had. It was one of the ways you knew what mattered to him, the things he came back to after everything else had been handled. Alfred was very good at his work. Chapter 2. The fortress had a rhythm, and in her first 2 weeks, Maya learned every beat of it. Dawn arrived not just as light through stone windows, but as sound, the low, rolling thunder from the training grounds in the outer court, where the pack wolves who preferred the pre-dawn hours ran their drills in wolf form before the sun was fully established. It was not an unpleasant sound. It was the sound of a place that was alive and functioning, the sound of an organized strength that was always ready. It settled Maya in a way she hadn't expected. She had grown up in a quieter territory, where mornings were slower. Here, the world was at work before she had finished waking. Her mornings began with the formal meeting in Adrian's study. He sat on one side of the long territorial table, and she sat on the other, and between them spread the morning reports, dispatches from patrol wolves at the outer boundary, supply inventories, weather predictions from the high peak observers, population counts from the pack settlements scattered across the Costa lands. They discussed all of it with the same brisk efficiency. He spoke. She listened. When she had a question, she asked it cleanly, without preamble. When he had a directive, he issued it without decoration. It was entirely impersonal, entirely efficient. And yet, on the 3rd morning, Maya asked a question about the water rights dispute in the northern settlement that Adrian had mentioned in passing, and she asked it with a specificity that suggested she had been considering it since he first raised it. He answered. She asked a follow-up that came at the issue from an angle he had not considered. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the relevant document. Then he incorporated her angle into his response to the northern settlement and moved on, and she filed that small fact carefully and quietly, and did not make anything of it. But she had noticed. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not look past her when she spoke. He did not do the thing that many powerful men did, which was to wait for their turn to speak while wearing the expression of listening. He actually considered what she said, and when it was useful, he used it, not with acknowledgement exactly, but without erasing where it came from either. She filed that away with the other things she was accumulating about him. She also began to understand the household. Marvis was the easiest. Marvis filled silences with information, the way running water fills any space it finds, and within 4 days Maya knew the name of every person in the fortress, the history of the 3 towers, the location of every heating duct and cold corridor, the precise reason the East Tower smelled faintly of old cedar in wet weather, and the rather complicated interpersonal geography of the kitchen, which apparently had its own social structure that operated entirely independently of the Alpha King's authority. Olivia, the fortress's senior household keeper, was a different kind of person entirely. Tall, measured, efficient in the way of someone who had been doing a thing for so long that she and the thing had become inseparable. She had managed the domestic workings of the mountain fortress for 15 years, and had developed, in that time, very clear ideas about how things should be done, who should do them, and at what hour. She was not unkind to Maya. She was not cold, exactly. She simply watched, with the patient, calibrating attention of a woman who had seen companions come and go, and had learned not to invest too quickly. Trust in this fortress was a thing earned over time. Maya understood that. She was not in a hurry. Ariel was the youngest of the inner household, barely 20, apprenticed to Olivia, still at the stage where her thoughts arrived on her face, slightly ahead of her ability to manage them. She had attached herself to Maya's orbit with a quiet intensity that was clearly admiration and clearly being held at arm's length by the awareness that admiration, unexplained, could be awkward. It was Ariel who first told Maya about Lila, not deliberately, not even completely. It came out sideways, the way things do when you are young enough to not yet have full control of the distance between what you know and what you say. They were in the upper garden, the sheltered terrace on the south tower where the household grew its culinary herbs, a rare and carefully maintained strip of growing things at an altitude that should not have supported them, tended with the persistence of people who had decided that altitude would not have the last word. Ariel was pointing out the varieties, which ones needed full sun, which preferred the shelter of the south-facing wall. The garden used to be larger, Ariel said, moving to the edge where a long stretch of bare stone ran along the outer wall. More flowering things. The Alpha King ordered it simplified a few years ago. Maya looked at the empty stone, which was too clean and too bare to be naturally so. Someone had deliberately removed something from here. You could feel the absence of it. Did he say why? Maya asked. Ariel's hand stilled on the herb stems she was trimming. A small hesitation. You don't have to tell me anything, Maya said gently. But you can, if you'd like. Another pause. Then, quietly, carefully. There was a woman. Before the scroll, before all of this. Her name was Lila. She was from one of the high-standing bloodlines. Old name, strong territory alliance, or everything that looks right from the outside. Everyone in the fortress said they were suited. She came and went for months. She was very— Ariel searched for the word. Decorative, about everything. She brought flowers. She had opinions about the rose garden. And then she stopped. And then she left, Maya said quietly. Ariel exhaled. She chose an eastern alliance, more territory, a stronger bloodline position for her family. She left in the night, while the Alpha King was on patrol. When he returned, Ariel's voice dropped even lower, reflexive caution. He had the roses taken out, all of them, within a week. And he didn't speak about it to anyone, and no one spoke to him about it. And then the scroll went out 6 months later. Maya looked at the bare stone where roses had been, and she thought about a man who was powerful enough to hold 400 years of bloodline together, and ancient enough to command wolves by the weight of his name alone, who had still, somehow, been wounded enough by one person's departure to uproot every bloom in his garden. She did not pity him. Pity would have been the wrong thing. What she felt was something quieter and more specific, the recognition of a wound she understood. Not the same wound, not the same shape, but the quality of it, the kind of hurt that doesn't make noise. She understood now, the ice that lived in the grey eyes. She understood the clinical precision of the scroll's wording. She understood the walls, and understanding something, even a hard thing, even a thing you have not been invited to understand, always felt better than blindness. The formal rules of the arrangement were laid out in full by Alfred and Edward on her second day, in the presence of both parties, read from a formal document in the ancient binding law language, and then translated into plain speech, because the ancient language was precise, but not universally readable. They shared the fortress. They shared the formal spaces, the study, the dining hall, the great territorial meeting room. They did not share chambers. They were addressed by the household in the ways their respective roles required. They shared meals at the long table in the great dining hall with the formal distance of the arrangement maintained. They did not touch. They did not discuss personal matters. The ancient laws required monthly reporting to Alfred and Edward, who would assess whether both parties were honoring their obligations. That they required the companion's presence at all formal territory gatherings, all pack council meetings, and all ceremonies of territorial significance. They required a settling period of 3 full moons before the arrangement was considered binding in the eyes of the pack law. Adrian stood at the window of his study while Alfred read the formal version, and when Alfred had finished, Adrian turned and said, "Any questions?" "One," Maya said. He waited. "The territorial reports. You mentioned I would be present for formal matters. I'd like to be useful to them, not merely present. I have some facility with territorial records. I managed the Stevens boundary accounts for 4 years. I'd like to contribute, where I can." A silence. "We will see," Adrian said. Chapter 3. By the beginning of the 4th week, the fortress had begun to feel less like a foreign country, and more like a place that was slowly, in its own careful way, deciding to let her stay. The staff had warmed by degrees. Marvis had made herself Maya's self-appointed guide, and could be found at her shoulder at entirely unpredictable moments, with useful information delivered at remarkable speed. Ariel had begun bringing small wildflowers from the lower grounds twice a week, left on the stone ledge outside Maya's chamber door with no note and no explanation, as though she hoped to claim plausible deniability. Even Olivia, who had watched from across rooms for the first 2 weeks, had begun to stand beside Maya rather than at a distance when they discussed the household, the shift from observation to cooperation that Maya understood was not given lightly. Alfred was spending more time in the morning meetings than his role strictly required. He would arrive after Adrian had established the day's agenda and sit at the end of the table with his documents and his quiet attention, contributing when invited and watching the rest of the time. Maya noticed the quality of that watching. He was not neutral in it. He had opinions. He was simply waiting for things to confirm or revise them. One morning, when Adrian had left the study early to address a patrol report from the west boundary, Alfred remained. He moved to the window, the same window Adrian stood at when he thought. Something about the view, Maya supposed. The mountains were easier to look at than most things. "You are not what I expected," Alfred said. It was the plain observation of a man who does not waste words on social currency. "Now what did you expect?" "Performance," he said. He turned from the window. The previous women who have been considered for arrangements like this one, they came performing. Softness, warmth, the particular art of seeming exactly right for the situation. You haven't performed anything. "No," Maya agreed. "I haven't. Why not? You know what is being evaluated." She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. Because he isn't looking for a performance. He may think he is. The scroll, the clinical terms, the ancient laws. But that's not what's actually missing here. She paused. And I don't know how to pretend to be something I'm not for long enough for it to matter. I've tried. I'm not good at it. Alfred studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, while with the particular weight of a man who has been hoping for a specific thing and has found it more fully than he expected, and left the room. It was not one moment that began the shift between Adrian and Maya. It was accumulation, the way seasons change. Not in a day, not in a week, but in the slow layering of small things until one morning the world is simply different. It was the evening he returned from a 3-day patrol of the eastern boundary, and instead of finding the map room empty and orderly, he found it occupied. Maya was at the table, 2 conflicting territorial reports spread in front of her, a 3rd document from the Central Archive open beside them, and annotations in precise, careful script along the margins of all 3. He stopped in the doorway. She heard the change in the air that meant someone had entered. She had been learning his presence, the specific quality of it, the way the atmosphere of a room shifted when he moved through it, and she turned. "The Eastern Scouts' boundary reports are inconsistent," she said. She was not announcing a discovery for his approval. She was simply reporting what she had found. "The 2nd patrol mapped the eastern marker 2 degrees off from the 1st survey. The discrepancy is small enough to miss if you're looking at each report individually, but I cross-referenced against the Central Archive map, and it's there. Either a scout made a recording error, or that marker was moved." He crossed the room to the table. He looked at what she had done, the annotations, the comparative mapping, the quiet, more systematic thoroughness of how she had laid it out. "When did you find this?" he asked. "This morning. I didn't want to raise it until I was certain." He looked at the maps for another moment, and then he looked at her profile. Not the careful evaluating look of the first night, not the study table formality of the morning meetings. Something quieter than that. Something that had no category yet. "I'll send word to the Eastern Scouts tonight," he said. It was not a thank you, but the way he said it, the faint softening of the clip deficiency that usually characterized his voice, carried more than the words themselves. Maya began rolling up the survey maps. She did not make anything of the moment. She simply filed it away with the others. The great storm came on a Thursday night. It rolled down from the Vorder Peaks with the particular ferocity of early winter. Not rain, but driven sleet, and a wind with real intent, the kind that found every gap in ancient stone and announced itself through it. The heating in the north corridor failed in the first hour. The dining hall became untenable before the formal dinner was even set. Marvis spent the better part of 2 hours reorganizing everything. The food, the linens, the lamp arrangements, into the smaller sitting room adjacent to the kitchens, a room that was warmer by virtue of proximity to the ovens, and intimate by virtue of containing 2/3 fewer chairs than the great dining hall. The architecture of the formal dinner had entirely collapsed. There was no long table. There was no designated seating arrangement that placed them at formal distance from each other. There was just firelight and food and 2 people sitting across from each other in the ordinary way of ordinary people sharing a space on an unpleasant evening, close enough that the conversation did not require elevation. Adrian poured whiskey from the decanter on the side table, dark whiskey that smelled of oak and age, and something that had been mellowing for longer than most decisions. He poured his own glass, and then, with a slight pause that contained within it a small and deliberate decision, he poured a second glass and set it in front of Maya. She picked it up. She did not make it notable. The fire was good. Outside, the storm moved through the mountain like something with purpose. Inside, the sitting room held its warmth well, and the low light from the lamps and the fire turned everything amber and close. They ate. They spoke, briefly, about the week's territory business, the eastern boundary matter, a supply timing question from the western settlements. And then the business was done, and the conversation simply stopped. But the stopping was not the formal silence of the study table. It was comfortable. The silence of people who are not working to fill a space. Adrian leaned back in his chair. His boots were off, a small informality that she had never seen from him before, and which indicated, she thought, that the disintegration of the formal arrangement had caught him slightly off guard, too. He held his whiskey glass loosely and looked at the fire. "Do you miss the Stevens territory?" he asked. The question arrived into the quiet with the weight of something that had been considered for longer than the moment. Maya turned her glass in her hands. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything, without dressing it up. "I miss the landscape, the flatlands, the way the sky sits differently there, lower and wider, like the whole world has more room to breathe. The light in autumn, especially." She paused. "I don't miss feeling invisible." She said it without bitterness. It was simply true, the way the names of places are true. She had been invisible there. She was not here. That was the arithmetic of the situation. He looked at her across the fire. The firelight moved between them, and his grey eyes had a quality she had not seen in them before. Not softened exactly, but open in a way that the study table, what with its formal arrangement and its deliberate distance, did not permit. "You are not invisible here," he said. He said it quietly, with a directness that was different from the directness of territory business, more personal, more careful in the way of something being offered without armor. She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her chest settled, like a stone finding the bottom. "I know," she said, just as quietly. The fire shifted. Neither of them spoke again for a long while. But the quality of the sitting room had changed, and they both knew it, and neither of them did anything to change it back. The full moon came at the end of the 3rd week. Maya was drawn to the upper terrace, the south tower garden, where the herbs grew in their careful rows, and the empty stone remembered roses, by something she could not have named. What a pull, a want to stand somewhere high and open with the moon above her, the kind of want that had never visited her much in the flatlands, but here, at altitude, seemed to live in the very stone. She did not expect Adrian to be there, but she was not entirely surprised when the quality of the air shifted, and she realized, without turning, that he had come up behind her. He stood beside her at the stone railing and said nothing. He did not explain his presence. He looked out at the silver-flooded peaks, the way he had looked at the territorial maps in the study, with full, quiet attention, as though the mountains were telling him something, in a language he had been learning for a long time. The mate bond had been present since the first morning. Maya had been very honest with herself about that. Was in the private hours when she could be honest about things without it mattering yet. She had felt it. That low, certain warmth, the hum of something deep recognizing something deep, from the moment she sat across from him in his study and looked at him directly and did not look away. She had told herself it was the altitude, then proximity, then the particular intensity of a man who occupies a room the way he does, filling every corner of it with the fact of his presence. She had been quite disciplined about not examining it too directly, standing beside him now on the high terrace with the full moon above and the mountains below and the whole ancient silver world spread out in every direction. That discipline was no longer available. The bond was not humming. It was singing, a warm, low, as entirely certain sound from somewhere beneath her ribs, the sound of something that had been patient for a very long time and had decided it had been patient long enough. She did not move. She did not say anything. She looked at the mountains. Beside her, she felt him shift slightly, the kind of small physical change that happens when someone adjusts the weight of something they are carrying, and she knew, without looking, that he felt it too. The bond was not partial. It never was, between true mates. It lived in both directions with equal intensity and equal inconvenience. She wondered what he was doing with it, pressing it down the way he pressed everything personal down, beneath the clean, controlled surface of governance and precision and the 6-inch walls of a man who had been hurt in a specific, a deep way, and had concluded that the construction of walls was cheaper than the alternative. She breathed. She let the moon be what it was. And she waited, the way she had always been able to wait. Not with resignation, not with the blunted hope of someone expecting disappointment, but with the clear, open patience of a woman who knows the difference between something worth waiting for and something not worth waiting for, and has categorized this accordingly. Chapter 4. The library was the one room in the mountain fortress that felt nothing like the rest of it. Everything else in the stronghold was built for function, for governance and strength and the projection of authority that a king's seat required. But the library had clearly been built by someone who loved books the way a wolf loves running, not as a pastime, and not as a social signal, but as a bone-deep need that didn't diminish with time or inconvenience. The shelves rose to heights that required rolling ladders. The volumes there were old enough that some required the specific reverence reserved for things that might not survive being dropped. Histories in the old script, territorial accounts from 4 centuries ago, poetry in languages that living wolves only half remembered. Maya had taken to spending her evenings there from the second week. It was not a strategic decision. The library simply felt like the truest room in the fortress, the room where the place admitted to having something inside it, beyond hard surfaces and authority. She was there on the 41st day of her time in the fortress. The moon was 2 days past full, to still bright enough to lay silver across the library floor through the tall windows. Every oil lamp in the room was lit, and the golden light turned the shelves into something cathedral and warm. She was in the deep chair nearest the window, her feet tucked under her, running her fingers along the spine of a volume of old verse that she had been working through in small pieces. The old language was slow reading, but worth it? She heard nothing. He moved like that. The absolute quiet of a man whose body had been trained to make no sound it did not intend to make. But she felt the shift in the air, the way the room rearranged itself slightly at the edges when he entered it, the way it always did. And she turned. He was at the far end of the library, near the door he had come through, standing in the shadow between 2 lamp circles. He was not in his formal clothes, Dark wool, heavy boots, the simple functional dress of the grounds. His hair was slightly disordered from the mountain wind. He had clearly been outside, on the upper walkway or the outer court, and he had come here afterward without changing, without the intermediate step of presenting himself in any particular way. He came toward her. The mate bond, which had been a warm and steady presence for weeks, did something very different then. It was not a hum. It was not even the singing she had felt on the terrace. It was an open, full-throated recognition, the sound a river makes when it finds the sea, when distance finally ends. It moved through Maya from the inside out, and she felt it in her hands, in her breath, or in the particular stillness that falls over a person when something important is happening, and they know it and do not look away. He stopped in front of the chair. He looked at her in the lamplight with grey eyes that held none of the formal distance, none of the careful management, none of the walls. The walls were still there. She could feel the framework of them, the architecture of his self-protection. But they were open. He had opened the door in them and walked through it himself, to come here, and the fact of that cost her an ordinary breath. He reached down and took the book from her hands, gently, the way you handle something precious, without looking away from her, and set it on the side table. His fingers brushed her knuckles as he did it. Such a small contact, or such a complete undoing of everything that small contact was not supposed to be. "I want some sugar," he said. His voice was low and rough, the voice of a man who had stopped managing how things came out and was simply saying what was true. "So I'm having you tonight." It was not a demand in the way of a king. It was a demand in the way of an honest man who has run out of reasons not to be honest. Beneath the certainty of it, beneath the Alpha's directness, she heard what else was in it. The question. The man beneath the king asking in the only plain language he had left. Maya looked at him. She had not come to this fortress for this, or she had told herself that. She had repeated it to herself every morning across the study table, every evening in the library, on the terrace with the mate bond singing in her chest. She had told herself, arrangement, terms, ancient laws, no sentiment. She had believed it less with every passing day. She rose. She was not tall. He had half a head on her easily. But she rose with the particular quality of stillness that was entirely hers, the quality Alfred had noticed on the first day, the thing that had survived every year of being overlooked and had not been carved away by it. And she looked at Adrian the way she had looked at him the very first night across the table in his firelit study, steadily, without softening, without performing anything. "Then come," she said. He did not take her to the East Wing chamber, assigned to her under the arrangement. He led her to his own rooms, a walk through the corridor she had never been invited to, past the study, or past the old door that marked the private quarters of the Alpha line. His chamber was large and spare and utterly masculine in the particular way of a space that has been organized entirely by its occupant's own preferences. Dark panelled walls, heavy draperies in the deep green of mountain pine, a broad hearth with a fire already laid and burning low. Shelves that held not books, but a careful collection of practical objects, and a few things whose meaning was personal and not immediately readable. The window faced the mountains, and the moon came through it in a long silver stripe across the stone floor. He turned when they were inside. He faced her, and something in him, the last of the formal architecture, the outer layers of Alpha King precision, simply released. The way a held breath releases, or the way a strung bow releases when it has been held too long and the hands finally allow it. His hands came to her face, both of them, large and warm and careful, cradling her jaw with a gentleness that was completely at odds with how she had imagined a man like him might touch anything. He held her face as though she were both precious and something he had been made to wait too long for. And he looked at her, really looked, the way he had never permitted himself in all the weeks of studied formality, with the specific attention of a man cataloguing something he intends to know completely. Then he kissed her. It was nothing like the cold efficiency of his governance, nothing like the iron precision of the formal arrangements. It was thorough and slow and deep and warm. The kiss of a man who has been keeping himself at arm's length from the possibility of warmth for long enough that now, finally standing in it, he had no interest in anything quick or careless. His hands moved from her face to her hair, to her shoulders, learning the shape of her the way you learn a territory, with full attention, with reverence, with the clear intention of understanding it completely. Maya's hands found his chest. She felt the solid, real weight of him, the steady drumbeat beneath her palms, and she held on. The room dissolved. The arrangement dissolved. The 7 covenant laws and the clinical ledger and the 3-moon settling period, all of it fell away into the simple, or absolute reality of 2 people who had been standing on the same truth for weeks and had finally stopped standing around it and stepped inside. He guided her toward the window, toward the moonlight, and in the silver and the warm dark, the mate bond finally, completely, without compromise, declared itself. Not as something new, as something being fully acknowledged for the first time. A recognition so deep and total it felt geological, ancient, the specific sensation of something that had always been there being called by its right name. He kissed the curve of her neck, the mark place where a mate bond claim would live, and even without the claiming mark yet, the touch sent a wave of warmth through Maya, so complete and so deep that her breath simply stopped for a moment, and she pressed her hands harder against his chest and felt his heartbeat, and used it to find her own again. He made a low sound against her skin, not words, something older than words, the sound a wolf makes when it has found its way home after a long journey it did not intend. "I see you," he said, finally, quietly. The words were barely louder than breath, meant for no other hearing in any world. Maya tipped her head back and looked at the stone ceiling above his shoulder, where the moonlight moved in slow patterns, and she felt something inside her that had been held very carefully, in a grip that had been so constant she had stopped noticing it, open. She pressed closer, and the moon held them both. Later, much later, the candles were very low, and the moon had moved across the window to its next position, and the night was in its deepest and most absolute quiet. They lay in the warmth of it, Maya on her back, looking at the ceiling patterns, Adrian beside her, his hand resting over hers on the coverlet, not holding exactly, but resting, the way you rest your hand on something you intend to be near for a long time, getting the feel of it under your palm. She could feel the mate bond the way she could feel her own heartbeat, constant, warm, present, not demanding now, not urgent, simply there, like the mountains outside, like the truth of a thing that has been true for a long time and knows it can afford to be quiet about itself. "You're thinking," she said. "I'm always thinking." "About what?" A long silence, or the kind that has weight in it. "About the fact," he said at last, "that this was not the plan." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." "The arrangement is still the arrangement," she said. "The laws haven't changed. Nothing has to change on paper. Not yet." She turned her head and found his profile in the dim light, the strong, clean line of it, the slight tension around the eye that meant he was working through something carefully. But something changed in here. between us. Tonight. He was quiet for a long time. Yes, he said finally. Quiet as the first snow. Entirely certain. Chapter 5. The morning after the library was the kind of morning that could not be anything other than what it was. Adrian was gone before the light came fully. She heard him leave while the moon was still above the horizon, heard the particular silence that his footsteps left behind in the corridor, and she did not call after him. She lay in the warmth of his chamber, and she was not hurt by his going, because she understood what it was. He was a man who had been standing still for 3 years, and she had just moved everything in him, and he needed the dark hour before dawn to be alone with the reality of it before the day began. She dressed. She returned to her own chamber. She stood at her window for a time, and looked at the same mountains from a different angle, and thought about the nature of patience, and what it was for. She had patience. She had always had it. Not as a virtue exactly, not the kind of patience that comes from not wanting things urgently enough, but the real kind, and the kind that knows the difference between something worth waiting for and something that has simply become waiting as a habit. This was worth it. She was certain of that. She was not going to shake that certainty loose with anxiety. She washed. She dressed in her morning things. She went to the study. He was already there when she arrived, already at the table, already with the morning reports, already in the precise professional clothes of the Alpha King, with the full posture of his governance restored. The distance was back in his bearing. The formal architecture was back. But his eyes, when they found hers, were different. The grey of them held something warmer than they had held in any morning before. It was not obvious. A person who had not been watching him carefully for weeks would not have caught it. But she had been watching carefully for weeks. She sat across from him. She gave him the slight smile that was entirely private, the size of something between them only. Not a challenge, not a performance, just an acknowledgement. Something moved in his jaw, not quite a smile, but the territory of one. They went through the reports. 3 days passed with the same outward routine. The formal mornings, the shared meals, the parallel movements through the fortress, but with the entirely different current beneath all of it. The mate bond between them was no longer the hidden thing she had been carefully not naming. It was simply present now. The way the mountains outside the window were present in every room they shared. She felt it in the specific way he was aware of her across distances. She would be in the library and feel the shift in her attention that meant he had entered the corridor outside it, still 4 rooms away. She would be in the map room and feel the moment he left the grounds and entered the fortress, the way you feel a change in weather before the first cloud arrives. It was not unpleasant. It was quietly extraordinary. On the evening of the 3rd day, he found her in the South Tower garden. She was watching the last light leave the peaks, that specific 3 minutes when the mountains turn from gold to copper to deep violet before the full dark takes them. He came to the railing beside her and stood without preamble. Not Alpha King business, just him. "There is something I need to tell you," he said, "before we go further." Maya turned to look at him. She waited. He was quiet in the way that means something is being assembled with care, not in the way that means nothing is there. 3 years ago, he began, before the scroll, before all of this, there was a woman named Lila, from a high bloodline. I chose her. Not through law, not through any formal process. I simply chose her. Believed she was what I wanted here, at the center of this territory, at the center of... He paused, tried again. I thought she felt the same, about this place, about the life here. Maya said nothing. She held the space for whatever came next. She left, he said flatly. She chose a better alliance, a stronger territory to the east. She left without a word, in the night, while I was on the outer patrol. When I returned, she was simply gone. No letter. No message through Alfred. Or nothing. He looked at the mountains. The Eastern Territory she allied with complicated our border agreements for nearly 2 seasons afterward. The careful way he ended that, on the territory consequence, the manageable practical result, was the most revealing thing he had said. She could feel, in the choice to land there, exactly what he was protecting. The peace that lived beneath the border agreements and the complicated seasons. You blame yourself, she said gently. I was careless, he said, the word carrying the full weight of his self-judgment. I allowed sentiment to override my judgment. I let someone through the walls of this place that I should not have trusted with what was inside, and in return, he stopped. She took something, Maya said. He did not answer, but he did not deny it. She looked at his profile for a long time, the clean, hard line of a man who hadn't said this aloud to anyone in 3 years, who had packed it into the stone of this fortress alongside everything else he had decided not to carry visibly, and who was saying it now because something had changed between them, and he was, beneath the walls and the precision and the ice, an honest person. You weren't careless, she said. You were just a person who wanted something real, and the person you chose to want it with wasn't honest with you. That is not your failure. That is hers. He looked at her. You are allowed to want things, Maya said. You are allowed to want them without a ledger to justify them. You are allowed to want. She paused, let the firelight settle between them. Things like this. Like what is already happening between us. Or you don't have to earn the right to want it by being certain it won't cost you anything. Wanting things costs something. That's what wanting is. Something in Adrian's face changed. The iron line of him didn't go away. It was part of him, built by 30-odd years of being an alpha king and 400 years of bloodline expectation. But something behind it shifted. The specific quality of guard that had lived there since Lila's leaving softened. Not disappeared, but moved from the position of door barring to something more like a window cracking open. He reached out and touched her face. His thumb traced along her cheekbone, slow and deliberate. His hand rested at her jaw. You are not what I planned for, he said. His voice was low and private. No, she agreed. I know. I am. He tried once more, or with the painstaking honesty of a man who has not said this kind of thing in years and has had to relearn how. I am glad you are here, Maya. She covered his hand with hers. The mountains held them in the cold and the dark. Christopher's first provocation came the next morning. The Border Scout arrived at dawn with the report that hunting parties bearing the Harren Pack insignia had been found inside the Costa territorial boundary at the northern ridge. Not near the border, not the ambiguous territory of a line, misremembered. Inside. Deliberately. The great hall transformed. Adrian moved through it with the contained, focused energy of a man who has a very specific kind of job and does it without wasting motion. Maps were unrolled. Lieutenants were summoned. Alfred and Edward took their places, while the whole of the fortress shifted gear from the domestic rhythm of the settlement period into something sharper and more urgent. Maya stood in the doorway. Marvis materialized at her shoulder. The household had learned to have someone available at such moments to steer the companion to the appropriate secondary space, away from the territory business that was not formally her domain. Maya thanked Marvis. She did not move. Across the room, past the lieutenants and the open maps and the charged attention of the assembled pack leadership, Adrian looked up and found her in the doorway. She held his gaze. She did not push. She did not demand anything. She simply remained, exactly as she had told him she would on the first night. Present. Fully. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Once. Almost imperceptibly. She crossed the room. She stood beside Edward at the map table and looked at the Northern Ridge Patrol reports. She did not speak immediately. She read. She cross-referenced what was in front of her against the territorial survey discrepancies she had catalogued over the past weeks, the eastern marker misalignment she had flagged, and Adrian had sent his scouts to verify. And she saw it. The marker that's being crossed, she said quietly to Edward beside her. Look at the survey reference number. It's the same marker from the inconsistent Eastern Patrol reports. Edward looked up from his documents. If that marker was moved before Christopher's hunting parties arrived, Maya said carefully, keeping her voice low, then what looks like a border violation from the Costa side might actually have been constructed to look that way. Or someone moved the reference point. Christopher's people may not have crossed where they think they crossed. Edward turned to Alfred. Alfred came to the map. Both of them studied what Maya was pointing to in silence. Then Alfred looked at Adrian. Adrian straightened. He looked at Maya. Show me, he said. 4 days. That was all it took once the original survey was retrieved and the marker discrepancy was properly documented and presented to the Interterritorial Elder Council. Christopher's incursion case collapsed. He had built it on a moved marker, had moved it himself, or had someone move it, specifically to manufacture a Costa violation that would give him grounds for territorial retaliation. Presented with the original documentation and the clear record of the marker's original placement, he had nothing. But the council ruled in the Costa territory's favor. Christopher withdrew his parties and his claim. The morning after the ruling, Edward stopped in the corridor as Maya was passing and said simply, "Good work." Coming from Edward, who measured his words the way a careful man measures medicine, it landed with a weight proportional to its brevity. Olivia found her in the kitchen corridor that evening and pressed her hand briefly to Maya's arm, the first time Olivia had touched her at all, and said, "Well done," without looking at her, which was somehow more genuine than if she had. Valerie, who had come in from the Western Reaches for the Border Council meeting and stayed to see the outcome, sought Maya out specifically. She was a broad-shouldered, silver-streaked wolf of perhaps 50, now with the particular bearing of someone who has held her part of the territory through many seasons and has opinions that she has learned to trust. She clasped Maya's hand in both of hers. The fortress needed eyes that see clearly, she said. She squeezed once, firmly. Welcome properly. Chapter 6. The month that followed was different from everything before it. Not dramatically, not announced, simply different, the way autumn becomes winter. In the long angle of the light, in the particular quality of the air, in the way the stones of the fortress held the cold now in a way they hadn't held it before. But where the season's change was a closing in, what was happening between Adrian and Maya was the opposite. An opening. Room being made. Space that had been carefully defended, being carefully given over. He no longer maintained the formal distance at the morning meetings. He sat closer to the side of the table where she sat, rather than across from her. He passed documents directly, rather than setting them at the midpoint. When she said something useful, he said so plainly, not effusively, not with the social warmth that wasn't native to him, but plainly. The way he said everything true. In the evenings, the library became theirs without anyone having decided it. He came, she was there. They talked, not about territory business, but about other things. He told her, one evening, about the winter he had spent at 17 at the far eastern border, during a boundary dispute that had lasted 8 months, when he had been young enough to be frightened and old enough to know he couldn't show it. She told him about the summer she had spent reading every history in the Stevens Territory archive after she had been passed over for the position that should have been hers. Not out of bitterness, but because she had decided that if she couldn't have the position, she was going to know more about the territory than anyone who had it. He laughed at that. A real laugh. Not a performance of amusement, but the genuine article. She catalogued it alongside everything else. One evening, the moon in its waning quarter, thin as a blade above the peaks, he reached across and closed the book in her hands. She looked up. He was looking at her with the directness that was simply his, without art, without management. Just the man and the grey eyes, and the thing he meant. "I want to change the terms of the arrangement," he said. Maya set her hands flat on the closed cover. She waited. "Not the legal terms," he said quickly. "The ancient laws stand. The formal arrangement stands. Alfred and Edward will keep the monthly assessments. The ceremony will proceed when the time comes. But the private terms, what we agreed to in the first meeting, no sentiment, no entanglements." He stopped. He was working through this with the particular effort of a man for whom words about feelings are a foreign language that he learned late and speaks carefully. "I cannot maintain them. I find another stop, another try. I find that I am not willing to apply the original framework to what this has become. Between us." The fire crackled. The library was very still. Maya looked at him, at the careful, proud way he held himself even in this, though even with the admission costing him something visible. And she felt something deep and fierce and tender move through her all at once. She had been waiting for this, not anxiously, not with her breath held, with the open, clear patience of a woman who knew it was coming and had not tried to hurry it. "Good," she said. He blinked. "Good." "I was going to tell you the same thing," she said. "I had given you until the end of the week before I said it myself." For one complete, unguarded moment, his face entirely open, the Alpha King entirely absent, he laughed, warm and surprised and real, and she felt it land in the center of her chest with a weight she recognized as permanent. She leaned across the table toward him. He met her there. The evenings that followed were different from the library night, where that had been the ignition point, the storm breaking, the walls giving, the long-held thing finally released. What came after was the rain that stays. Slower, more deliberate, built on the knowledge that this was not a single night or a single moment, but something ongoing, something they were choosing repeatedly. He was careful with her in a way she had not expected. Not tentative. Adrian was never tentative, but considered. Intentional. He touched her with the attention of a man who has decided that this person matters and intends to honor that. He held her face. He pressed his lips to her hair. He pulled her close in the quiet of the evening without explanation or announcement, simply because she was there and because he wanted her near. One night, he showed her the scar at his collarbone. He did not make a ceremony of it. They were sitting together near the fire in his chamber, and he simply pulled the collar of his shirt aside and showed her, a pale, raised line about the length of her palm, marking where a blade had found him in his early years as Alpha King, a challenge from a rival bloodline that he had won by a margin that still occasionally visited him in dreams. She reached out and traced it with one finger. He went very still. She pressed her lips to it. A simple thing, no more than a quiet acknowledgement of something that had hurt him and healed wrong, and was still there. "No one has ever," he began, and stopped. "You don't have to explain," she said. "I want to," he said. His hand came up and covered hers where it rested on the scar. He held it there with a grip that was gentler than his usual grip. "But you are the first person in 3 years that I have wanted to tell things to. The first person I have wanted in this." He paused. His thumb moved over her knuckles. "In this whole space with me. Not the fortress. The space inside the fortress." She looked up at him. He pressed his forehead to hers. The mate greeting, the oldest acknowledgement in the wolf world, the one that predated language, that meant, "I recognize you. I claim you. I am here." He held it for a long moment, their foreheads together, and breathing the same air. "Almost," she said. He understood. The claiming, the full mark, the full bond, was close. Both of them could feel it. The mate bond between them had been building toward it since the first morning, and now it was at the threshold, patient and certain. "Is that what you want?" he said. His voice low, directly against her temple. The marking, the full bond before the pack. She turned her face toward his in answer. He breathed against her cheekbone for a moment. She felt the warmth of it, the slow deliberateness of a man learning that he does not have to rush anything he actually wants. And then he kissed her, warm and deep and entirely certain, and she held on with both hands. Chapter 7. The announcement came on the first morning of the final moon. Alfred and Edward arrived at the morning meeting in their formal elders' robes, deep blue, the colour only ever worn for territory ceremonies, the dye made from plants that grew only at specific elevations and were collected by hand in specific seasons, the colour that meant this moment is significant. Pay attention. They placed the ceremonial documents on the table with the careful precision of men doing something that had been done the same way for 400 years and would be done the same way for 400 more. The settling period had passed. The arrangement had been honoured on all accounts. The ancient laws were satisfied. The next step was the union. Alfred explained what the ceremony required. The formal words in the old language, the gathering of the pack, the public acknowledgement before witnesses, and the marking. The mate bond claim, pressed into skin by both parties before the full assembly of the Costa wolves. The moment at which the companion under arrangement became, in the eyes of the pack and the ancient laws and the territory itself, the Alpha King's true queen. Maya looked across the table at Adrian. He was already looking at her. "You don't need to decide immediately," Alfred said, with the diplomacy of a man who had already decided how this was going to go and was giving it the form of a choice. "I have decided," Adrian said. He did not look away from Maya. "The ceremony will be at the next full moon." "That is 11 days, Edward noted. "Then we have 11 days, Adrian said. Simply, as though 11 days was exactly the right number of days for something that had already been decided by something older than calendars. Maya held his gaze across the table and felt the mate bond settle into the certainty of what was coming, warm and quiet and completely sure of itself. 11 days, she agreed. The fortress transformed. Not overnight. Over 11 days, incrementally, as the way the seasons had been transforming the mountain landscape outside at the same time. The great hall came alive with a different kind of industry than the governance activity that normally filled it. The copper lamps were brought down from the upper stores and polished and hung. The old ceremonial tapestries that stayed in the archive room through most of the year were carefully unrolled and assessed for rehang. The kitchen expanded into preparations that kept every member of the household in productive motion from early morning to well past dark. Marvis was in her absolute element. She moved through the fortress at a pace that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this occasion and had been storing energy for it specifically. Ariel brought Maya flowers every day of the 11 days, not the practical herbs from the garden, but actual flowers, which required hiking down to the lower grounds where the autumn flowers were still holding on against the cold. She left them at the door of Maya's chamber without explanation, as she always did, but the frequency increased as the ceremony day approached, as though the flowers were a way of marking time. Olivia came to Maya on the 7th day and said, without preamble, "I would like to help you prepare for the ceremony, if you would allow it." She said it in the tone of someone offering something significant and not being entirely comfortable with how significant it felt. "I would be grateful," Maya said. Olivia nodded once, briskly, and the subject was closed in the way that meant it had also been opened. The pack members began arriving 2 days before the ceremony, but they came from every corner of the Costa lands, the near settlements and the far ones, the high-elevation packholds, and the lowland groups that lived closer to the border. They came in ones and twos and small family groups, wolves who had pledged to this bloodline and to this alpha, and who came now to witness something their alpha had not given them before. Maya met them in the great hall during the arrival days, standing beside Adrian. Not behind him. Beside him. He introduced her by name, simply directly, as he did everything. Not with title, not with the formal language of arrangement. Just Maya. The quality of the introduction said the rest. The pack felt the mate bond. They always do. It is the particular inheritance of wolves, the ability to feel, as a community, the deep bond of their alpha. An alpha's true mate isn't invisible to the pack, even in a crowd. The bond carries. It resonates in the air the way a harmony carries, even when the melody is what you are listening for. They felt it between Adrian and Maya, and it settled something in them that had been unsettled for 3 years. Something the Lila situation had left slightly undone. A gap in the pack's sense of wholeness, a specific kind of incomplete warmth at the center of their shared experience. True mates completing their bond did not just affect the two of them. It rippled outward, a wave of rightness felt in the collective body of the pack. Valerie clasped Maya's hand and said what she had said before. About time. Claire from the northern settlements pressed the worked silver gifts into Maya's hands, with her own hands shaking slightly from cold and feeling. Orena, the young delegate from the Far Eastern holdings, who had been attempting seriousness all day with her very young face, finally abandoned the attempt when the gifts were given and let her excitement show completely, which was a relief to everyone who had been watching her try. Alfred, standing to one side of it all with Edward, watched the arrivals and the greetings and the shift in the quality of the gathering, with the satisfaction of a man whose work is being demonstrated before him in real time. He said nothing. He did not need to. The night before the ceremony, Adrian came to Maya's chamber. He did not come with ceremony. He sat beside her at the window, and they looked at the mountains together for a while, and then he turned to look at her in the way he had come to look at her over the past weeks, directly, fully, without the management of distance. "I need you to know something before tomorrow," he said. Before the pack, before the words, before all of it. She faced him. "What I am asking of you in the ceremony, the marking, the full bond, the union before the pack, it is not the arrangement asking it. It is not the ancient laws or the bloodline or the necessity of a legacy." He paused, held her gaze with the full weight of everything he was. "It is me. I am asking it. I am choosing you. Entirely. Whatever that makes me. Whatever it costs." She looked at him, at the face she had been learning since the first firelit evening. The clean lines and the grey eyes, and the particular quality of pride that he wore like a second skin, and which she had come to understand was not arrogance, but self-possession, or the pride of a man who has held something difficult together for a long time by the force of his own integrity. She reached out and took both his hands in hers. She held them the way the old bond greeting described. Full palms, the complete contact, the mate's acceptance of the mate's claim. "I know what it costs you," she said. "I have known for a long time, and I want you to know." She paused, found the precise truth. "I am not afraid of what it costs. I have spent 27 years being careful with what I want. I am not going to be careful with this." She squeezed his hands. "You are the thing I am not going to be careful with." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he lifted her hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles. Both of them. Slowly, but with the full gravity of a man who doesn't do things halfway when he has decided to do them at all. "Then let us not waste a moment of it," he said. The full moon came over the Vorda peaks on the night of the ceremony like a declaration. It rose fast and brilliant, and absolutely without apology. The way mountain moons rise, all at once, none of the slow amber drift of the flatland moon, just a clean silver ascension that turned the peaks and the high walls of the fortress, and the assembled pack and the stone of the outer court all to the same luminous, ancient colour. Everything under it looked like it had always looked this way, like the moonlight was the original state of things, and everything else was temporary. The outer court was full, was, to pack wolves from every reach of the Costa territory stood in a wide ring around the ceremony space. The torches along the outer walls burned steady in the cold air. The copper lamps had been arranged in a wide circle at the centre of the court, and their light was warm and low and golden against the silver of the moon, and together they made something that had no name in any modern language, but was recognized in the very old one. Alfred and Edward stood at the north point of the circle in their deep blue ceremonial robes, the formal record documents in Alfred's hands, the bond law text in Edward's. The pack was quiet. Not the silence of people waiting for something to begin, but the silence of people who are already inside something. Maya came in from the south. She had dressed simply. Deep green, the colour of the mountain pines below the Vorda line, the colour of Adrian's chamber. Her hair was down. She wore Claire's worked silver at her wrists and throat. She had no attendant. She had dressed herself. She walked through the assembled pack and felt every gaze follow her, and she did not hurry, and she did not look down. She walked the way she had always walked when she was being entirely herself, at her own pace, with her own quality of stillness, the thing that had always been hers and had survived every year of being overlooked without being diminished. Adrian was waiting at the centre of the circle. He was in the full ceremonial dress of the Costa Alpha line for the first time she had seen it, black and deep gold, the ancient bloodline crest at his chest. Yet the formal elder markings worked into the collar and cuffs in the old Covenant style. He was the Alpha King completely, the whole accumulated weight of 4 centuries of this bloodline standing in the present moment, in the moonlight, with the pack around him. He watched her cross the court. When she reached the circle and stopped before him, the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on it in all the weeks of mornings and evenings, and the library and the high terrace. No iron, no precision, no Alpha King management. Just Adrian. Just the man who had come to a library in the deep of the night with nothing but the simple truth of what he wanted, and who had been choosing her every day since. Alfred began the old ceremony words. The ancient tongue of the binding laws was not meant for ordinary speech, or it was made for this, for the resonant, formal moments when what was being said needed to carry weight beyond the meaning of individual words. Edward's voice joined Alfred's on the response lines, and the sound moved through the assembled pack like something physical, something felt in the chest and the bone. When the first response was required, Adrian spoke it, low and certain in the old language, his voice carrying into the mountain air with the completeness of a man who had made his decision thoroughly and had no reservation about any part of it. Then Alfred turned to Maya. She spoke the response in the ancient tongue. She had learned it from the old volumes in the library, in the quiet hours before this night. Learned the pronunciation from the phonetic guide in the oldest archive text. Learned the cadence from the ceremonial history records. Learned what it meant word by word from the side column translation she had made in small, careful writing in the margins of a notebook she kept for this purpose. Alfred's eyebrows moved very slightly. Edward turned his face aside in the way of a man containing a smile with significant effort. Adrian looked at her as though she had given him something rare. Then came the marking. This was the oldest part. Older than the formal language, older than the ceremonial dress, older than the gathered witnesses. It was the primal heart of what it meant to be wolves, to carry the mate bond, to choose someone before the whole living body of the pack. Adrian stepped closer to her. He raised his hand and placed his thumb at the curve of her neck. The mark place, the specific spot where the bond claim would live permanently, the place his lips had found in his chamber in the weeks before this, and had returned to again and again with the patience of someone who knew what was coming. He looked into her eyes as he traced the place. The pack was absolutely still. The torches burned. The moon was exactly overhead. He lowered his head. When his lips found the mark place and the claiming finally completed, when what the mate bond had been building toward since the first morning in his study was fully, completely, publicly acknowledged, the effect moved through the assembled wolves like a wave through deep water. Not heard, felt, in the chest, in the bone, in the deep place where the pack bond lived. The bond between an alpha king and his true mate, when fully claimed, and is not a private thing, even when it happens privately. It resonates outward. The whole pack carries a piece of it, the specific warmth of a center made whole, of a lineage given its completion. The Costa wolves felt it ripple through them, and they were quiet with the weight of it, and it was the most significant silence Maya had ever stood inside. She felt the mark settle. Then she turned her face toward his throat. The mirror claim, the mate's mark on the alpha, moving in both directions or meaning nothing, was hers to give. She pressed her lips to the warm skin at his jaw, at the place she had come to know through weeks of evenings, and she gave the claiming back to him in full measure, and the pack felt that too, and the sound that went up from the assembled Costa wolves then was not a cheer in the modern sense, but something older and lower and more true. The sound a whole body makes when a gap in it is healed. Adrian lifted his head. He looked at her in the copper light and the silver and everything that they had become to each other, and he was smiling. Not the barely held warmth she had catalogued in the early weeks, not the surprised, unguarded laugh from the library, not even the open smile she had seen grow more frequent as the walls came further back. This was the full thing, the face of a man who has set down a weight he carried for 3 years, and does not yet entirely know what to do with the new lightness of himself. Maya reached up and pressed her fingers to the line of that smile. She had never seen it look like this, as she intended to see it for the rest of her life. "My queen," he said. The 2 words were entirely simple, entirely vast. "My king," she said, and every meaning of it landed in her with equal weight. The celebration that came after was everything the fortress had forgotten it knew how to be. The great hall opened. The kitchen unleashed what Marvis had been assembling for 11 days, and the result was extraordinary. A feast that filled the hall with heat and smell, and the kind of abundance that is only possible when someone has been planning it with dedication and love. The pack wolves who had travelled to witness the union filled the space with the warm, specific chaos of people who belong to each other and are glad of it. Old wolves and young ones, far territory families and near settlement groups, are all held by the same ancient loyalty and released tonight into pure, uncomplicated joy. Valerie danced. She was, it turned out, an unexpectedly gifted dancer for someone who presented primarily as a pragmatic border wolf. Claire and Ariel found each other in the crowd and became fast friends within approximately 20 minutes, which surprised no one who had met either of them. Raina, who had been maintaining great composure all day with considerable effort, lasted until the third song, and then simply gave herself entirely over to the evening, with the specific abandon of someone who has been trying to be an adult for about a year, and has just remembered they are 19. Alfred and Edward sat together near the hearth fire with their shared drink and their shared silence, and their shared, deep satisfaction. They had done their work, or this was the evidence of it. Alfred caught Maya's eye across the hall at one point and raised his glass to her. No words, no ceremony, just the small, precise gesture of a man who had placed a careful bet and watched it pay out fully. She raised hers in return. At some point deep in the evening, when the hall was warm with bodies and the music had settled into the slower songs, and the night was at that stage of celebration where the urgency has given way to something more contented, Adrian found Maya's hand under the table. Quietly. Not displayed. Not announced, just his hand finding hers and holding it with the easy, uncomplicated certainty of a man who has decided what he wants to hold and sees no reason to be subtle about it. She held back. They stayed like that for a long time. The Alpha King and his queen were at the center of their pack, at the center of their celebration, at the center of the life they had built between them in the mountain fortress over 3 moons and 11 days, and one night in a library where everything changed. Later still, when the great hall had begun to empty, and the last of the celebration had settled into warm fatigue and fond goodbyes, they stood once more at the high terrace, the South Tower garden, the place where the moon always found them eventually. The moon was low now, beginning its descent toward the western peaks, and its light was amber at the edges, where it had been silver before. The mountains were still and enormous, and entirely indifferent to human things, the way they had always been, and would always be, which was one of the things Maya had come to love about them. Their perfect, but ancient lack of interest in anything that lasted less than 1,000 years. The cold was the real mountain cold of deep autumn, pressing and insistent, the kind that does not ask permission. Adrian stood behind her, his arms around her, his chin at her temple, not because she needed the warmth, but because he wanted to be there, between her and the weather, for no reason except that this was where he wanted to be. The mate bond between them was quiet now, not the urgency of the ignition, not the bright heat of the claiming. Something that had found its level. The warmth of a thing that does not need to announce itself because it has become structural, woven into the architecture of who they were now, individually and together, the way the old symbols were woven into the stone of the fortress gates. "I owe Alfred an apology," he said. She smiled against the cold air. "Why?" "He put your name at the bottom of the list on purpose." "I know," she said. "I figured that out months ago." A pause. "You never said anything." "Of course not." She tilted her face up toward him slightly. "It worked, didn't it?" She felt him press a kiss to her hair. The warmth of it. "Yes," he said. "It worked." Below them, the mountain fortress held the warmth of the celebration inside its ancient walls. the torchlight still burning in the lower windows, the last few voices of the night drifting up from the outer court, the sound of a living, whole, satisfied place. The sound of a territory with its king and its queen at the top of it, and every wolf in between accounted for. I thought, Adrian said, after a silence that had been entirely comfortable, that I was going to spend the rest of my life managing this territory alone, efficiently, without the complications. I know, Maya said. I thought the complications were the problem. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. Then, they're not the problem. No, she said. They're the point. He turned her in his arms then, not urgently, just completely, and held her face in his hands the way he had in the library on the first night, and looked at her in the last light of the descending moon, with every wall open, and nothing managed, and just the man. Thank you for coming, he said, for answering the scroll, for not being what I planned for. She put her hands over his, where they cradled her face. Thank you for leaving my name for last, she said. He laughed, warm and real and entirely surprised by her, by which she intended to remain for as long as they both had. Then he kissed her under the low moon, and the mountains watched, and the Vorda peaks kept their cold and their silence and their 400-year indifference to everything that lasted less than forever. And inside the fortress that had been built to endure, inside the arms of a king who had remembered, with great difficulty and considerable help, how to be a man who could be loved, Maya was exactly where she had been moving toward her entire life, not at the edge of someone else's table, at the center of her own. If the story of Adrian and Maya stirred something in you, if you felt the mate bond, lived through the claiming, and stood on that high terrace with the mountains and the moon, then make sure you hit like and subscribe. Join us for more tales of fated love, ancient bonds, and wolves who find their way home. You are watching Marked by Midnight.